In the maze-like neighborhoods of Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant in early 2000s Brooklyn, people came and went like the shifting tides. Street corners changed, buildings changed, faces changed. But some names, some stories, stayed. Some cast shadows. And one of the darkest names whispered through those streets belongs to a man who lived most of his life hiding in plain sight. Kwauhuru Govan. This is not the story of a criminal mastermind or a man with a tragic backstory twisted by unfortunate circumstance. It is the story of a figure who moved quietly through the borough until bodies began turning up, until patterns emerged, and until cold case detectives, more than a decade later, would say they believed he might have been something far more dangerous than anyone realized. This is the story of the man once called a suspected serial killer. The man tied to fear, suspicion, and heartbreak, but who still remains, in many ways, an enigma, a face in the neighborhood. Kwauhuru Govan's story begins in Brooklyn in the late 1970s, born into a city that was rough, loud, and unforgiving. He grew up on Gates Avenue, right in the heart of Bushwick, the same neighborhood where many of his later victims lived, walked, and laughed. Neighbors from that era have said almost nothing about his childhood, because nothing stood out. He wasn't the loud kid. He wasn't the class clown. He wasn't the neighborhood menace. He was just another face, quiet, average, and forgettable. But something was brewing behind that quiet. Something no one could see yet. By his mid-20s, Govan was already tangled in the criminal justice system. Arrests, prison time, brushes with the law, all hinting at a man spiraling into darker instincts. Still, nothing suggested what was coming. Nothing warned the community that they were living beside a man who would later be accused of some of the most disturbing crimes Brooklyn had seen in decades. The first known victim. The year was 2004. Brooklyn was waking up from winter's grip when 17-year-old Sherabia Thomas disappeared on her way to school. She was young, bright, and full of ambition. She had a life waiting for her. Dreams, family, friends, all the things that anchor a teenager to the world. When her body was discovered days later, inside 2 laundry bags left in an alley, the neighborhood shook. Her death was brutal, intimate, and terrifying. The case went cold almost immediately. No witnesses, no camera footage, no confession, and DNA science at the time wasn't advanced enough to give detectives the break they needed. Meanwhile, life moved on, or at least it tried to. For Govan, life took him in and out of New York, down to Florida, back into more trouble, more arrests, more time behind bars. Still, he was free from suspicion in Sherabia's murder, at least for the moment. But cold cases don't stay cold forever. Murder in the subway shadows. Just 1 year later, in February 2005, another Brooklyn family's world shattered. 19-year-old Brazelle vanished on Valentine's Day after leaving his Bushwick apartment with an unidentified man. Days later, transit workers found dismembered remains inside trash bags deep in the subway tunnels of the A line. More bags were found a week later at a recycling facility. It was a gruesome crime that required planning, strength, knowledge of transit tunnels, and a level of coldness that shook detectives to their core. The case fascinated the public and horrified the city. Who could do something like this? Why Rashawn? And how did the killer know where to dump the remains without being seen? What no one realized, not yet, was that both Sherabia and Rashawn lived near the same area. The killers of both moved through the same streets, and the same man may have been orbiting their lives. But it would take more than a decade for detectives to make that connection. A cold case awakens. Fast forward to 2016. DNA technology had evolved. New techniques allowed crime labs to retest old evidence with incredible precision. When investigators revisited the Sherabia Thomas case, they tested the fingernail clippings she had left behind. Desperate defensive wounds from a young girl fighting for her life. And in those tiny slivers of tissue was a name. Kwauhuru Govan. Detectives tracked him down in a Florida prison. They flew across states to interview him. They built the case carefully, piece by piece. And in 2016, more than 12 years after Sherabia's murder, they charged him. But something else happened. Something unexpected. As detectives dug deeper into Govan's past, His connections, his whereabouts, and his behavior, a disturbing possibility surfaced. This might not be his only victim. The whispers around the Brazelle case suddenly grew louder. Govan had lived near Rashawn's family. He had been in the neighborhood during that time. He had a criminal history, and the brutality, the methodical nature of the crime, it all raised suspicions. By 2017, authorities charged him with Rashawn's murder too. For a moment, it seemed like both families might finally see justice. The man in the courtroom. But when Govan stepped into the courtroom, he wasn't quiet anymore. He shouted at the judge. He cursed at prosecutors. He refused fingerprinting. He kicked, screamed, and spat accusations of conspiracy. At one hearing, when the judge explained the charges, he blurted out the now infamous line, "I can't even dissect a frog." At another, he allegedly mouthed, "You know I love you," toward Rashawn's mother, a moment she rejected with absolute fury. To prosecutors, his behavior was the outburst of a man cornered by his own crimes. To his defenders, it was the reaction of someone who believed he was being framed. But chaos in the courtroom does not equal guilt, and prosecutors have to win cases on evidence, not emotion. The devil in the details. While digging into Govan's belongings during the Sherabia Thomas investigation, authorities found something chilling: a notebook. Inside it was a sketch, a drawing of a device that looked like a chair designed to restrain women during sexual encounters. It wasn't proof, but it painted a deeply unsettling picture. Combine that with the similarities between Sherabia's and Rashawn's cases: strangulation, disposal in bags, secrecy, and efficiency, and the pattern detectives saw was hard to ignore. Police began to suggest publicly that Govan could be a serial predator, someone who didn't kill once out of rage, but who hunted, planned, and executed with disturbing precision. And yet, the law requires more than suspicion. Justice for Sherabia. In 2018, a Brooklyn jury found Govan guilty of the murder of Sherabia Thomas. The DNA was overwhelming, the evidence was strong, and the pattern of control was undeniable. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring that this young woman's killer would never breathe free air for decades. But for Rashawn's case, justice would not come so easily. A case slipping away. Prosecutors eventually faced a painful truth. The evidence against Govan in the Brazelle murder wasn't strong enough to guarantee a conviction. No DNA linking him to the remains. No direct witness placing him with Rashawn at the critical moment. No confession, no fingerprints, no physical evidence. They believed he might have done it, possibly. They suspected he was capable. Absolutely. They felt the similarities were too close to ignore. But too close isn't enough in court. If they went to trial and lost, double jeopardy laws would mean they could never try him again, even if stronger evidence surfaced later. So the charges were dropped. Just like that, the Brazelle case slipped back into unsolved territory. A wound reopened, a family left without answers. The unconfirmed victims. As Govan's name spread through news reports, other stories bubbled to the surface, like the woman known as Fatima, who came forward claiming she survived an attack in the mid-2000s. A man in a van, a badge flashed, a violent assault, a narrow escape. She believed the man who attacked her looked and sounded like Govan. It was never proven. He was never charged. But the allegation added yet another layer to the portrait forming around him. A portrait of a man who moved with predatory confidence. A man who may have stalked the streets of Bushwick far longer than anyone realized. Who is Kwauhuru Govan? When you look at the full picture, the murder he was convicted of, the murder he was charged with but not convicted of, the alleged survivors, the notebook sketches, the courtroom chaos, the cold case patterns, you're left with a question that chills the spine. Is Kwauhuru Govan a serial killer whose legacy of violence remains mostly hidden, or is he a violent criminal who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when cold case detectives were desperate for answers? The truth may sit somewhere in between, or it may be buried in secrets known only to him. What is certain is this. One young woman, Sherabia Thomas, died at his hands. The court proved that. Another young man, Brazelle, was murdered in a way eerily similar, but the system couldn't prove his involvement. And countless other cases linger, unresolved, haunting detectives who believe there may be victims still unnamed. A name that still haunts Brooklyn. Today, Kwauhuru Govan remains behind bars, serving his life sentence. But outside those prison walls, his name echoes through Brooklyn's unsolved crimes, its whispered stories, its lingering fears. He is a man who walked quietly among people who had no idea what he was capable of, or what he was accused of. And in the end, his story leaves us with a chilling truth. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones hiding in the dark. Sometimes they're the ones walking beside us, unnoticed, until the day the truth finally claws its way to the surface.